Hello and welcome to our lecture for May. My name is Rachel Lovett. I'm the curator and assistant director here at the historic Hammond-Harwood House in downtown Annapolis. And I'm really pleased to be speaking with you today to present this wonderful lecture. We have Dr. Michael Parker. But before I get into introducing Dr. Michael Parker, I do want to mention that this wonderful lecture is free and open to the public, thanks to the generosity of our donor, Cathleen Farr. So very much thank you to Cathleen, who has been one of our wonderful docents for many years. So today we have a lecture, William Oliver Stevens, the Harwood Sisters, and Annapolis. And William Oliver Stevens is certainly very interesting towards the Hammond-Harwood House because he actually lived at Hammond-Harwood House. And we're presenting live today from the section of the house in which he lived. So that's an added bonus. Now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Parker. He's Professor Emeritus of the English Department at the United States Naval Academy. He has written widely on 17th century poetry and Annapolis and local history. And he has been researching Stevens since 1985. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Michael Parker.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Let me begin by just giving my thanks to a number of people who have helped make this lecture possible. The first, Jennifer Bryan, head of special collections at Nimitz Library, who shared some of the photos that they have of Stevens. Ken Kimball, who first joined me in pursuit of William Oliver Stevens back in 1985, and who also shared his photos from that period. Alice Creighton, the former head of special collections at the Naval Academy, who really encouraged me to do this and who mounted a display on Stevens back in 1987. And finally, to Rachel Lovett and the whole staff of the Hammond-Harwood House, who invited me to give this lecture and who have provided extraordinary assistance and probably will still continue to do so in the next hour in making it possible. Well, let me begin. Back when I was about 12 years old, I lived in Montgomery County and my family took a trip to Annapolis. And we came, looked around. I got very interested in the city. And when I went back home, I went to the Silver Spring Library, looked at the books they had, and checked out a volume that looks like this. It was Annapolis and Arundels town, and I read it at the time. I remember it as being really interesting, and then forgot about it until in 1979, I was offered a position at the Naval Academy, came back, and over the next few years, I got involved in learning more about Annapolis history and turned back to this book. Well, when I did, I decided to learn more about William Oliver Stevens, who seemed to know a lot about the Academy itself and the English department. And I discovered he had been a professor of English, as I was, and we had both gone to the same graduate school. So, and we had come at the same age. So I thought, oh, there's some sort of bond here. I went up to archives in the Naval Academy where they keep a lot of faculty records for people who are no longer living. And I remember sitting at the table, it was in July in the afternoon, and Jane Price, the assistant to the archivist, came out with these big piles of manila folders. And she said, I think you'll find this a very interesting story. And indeed I did. And the last paper in all the files, which I spent the entire afternoon reading, the last paper was a letter from Stevens's son, Hugo, informing the superintendent at the time, Walter Boone, that his father had died. This was in 1955. Well, there was an address on the letter. And when I went home that evening after dinner, I called directory assistants. These were the days when you could do such a thing. And I got a phone number and I made the call. And indeed, I had Hugo Stevens on the line 30 years after you'd written that letter. And we spent an hour on the phone. And that's how it all began. I went down about 2 months later to visit Hugo Stevens, and Ken Kimball drove with me. And we both had a really wonderful afternoon. Hugo was a lot of fun, an interesting man who is a portrait painter by profession. And the family couldn't have been more welcoming. And that's what set me off into learning more and more about Stevens. And I'm going to share this with you today. Stevens makes a good choice for this lecture series for 3 reasons. The first is he was one of the most distinguished people ever to live in the Hammond-Harwood House. During his career, he published 49 books, well over 100 articles, everything from little books of caricatures and cartoons to academic tomes on Anglo-Saxon literature, from travel books to pretty weighty articles on naval and foreign policy. So Stevens is an interesting character that way. Secondly, in Annapolis and Arundels town, he gives us one of the best accounts of the Harwood sisters, maybe the most detailed, and gives us a sense of what it was like to know Miss Lucy and Miss Hester close up. And finally, I think that he's a good subject for this lecture series because his time at the Hammond-Harwood House, only a year, really for him grounded him in Annapolis. The Harwood sisters and the house came to embody what Annapolis was for him. Sort of quirky, sort of crazy, always interesting, and at the same time sort of romantic and evocative of a different era. So for those reasons, I think that this is a good subject. Well, let's begin with, first of all, I'm going to have trouble, by the way. Oops, here we go. Keeping up with my slides because I always start talking and forget to do it. Here's Stevens in about 1920 when he would have been, let's see, he would have been in his early 40s, so about 43. Good looking man and good looking all his life. Stevens was born in October 1878 in Rangoon, Burma, now Yangon, Myanmar. His parents were Baptist missionaries in Burma, as were his grandparents. His great-grandfather on his father's side, Edward Abile Stevens, translated the Bible into Burmese. His maternal grandfather, Francis Mason, translated the Bible into the Karen language of the people who live along the Thai-Burmese border. And Francis Mason was a real polymath who published books on natural history, on all sorts of Southeast Asian affairs. He was known as the apostle to the Karens. He believed that they were descendants of one of the lost tribes of Israel because they had many, many myths that resembled stories from the Old Testament. Probably not the case, but he was much beloved and he lived into his 80s working there. Stevens lived in Burma until 1886. And this was a very interesting time because the British had taken possession of Rangoon back in the 1820s in a short war in which, by the way, Jane Austen's brother was one of the most prominent characters. I think that was Edward Austen. And then in the 1880s, there was a lot of diplomatic tension between France and Britain over the independent Burmese kingdom centered in Mandalay. And in 1885, the British sent an expeditionary force, overthrew the Kingdom of Burma and made it a protectorate of Britain and attached it ultimately to India. The King of Burma went into exile. There's a good story about him and Stevens's father that if you're interested, we can ask in the question period. But at any rate, at this point, after the war was over, Mrs. Stevens, Harriet Callista Mason Stevens, decided to take the older children back to the US for their education. So the oldest girl, Mariah, another brother, George, and then William Oliver went with her took a steamship to London and then to New York and then to Framingham, Massachusetts, where Stevens lived first with his aunt and uncle. And then eventually his sister Mariah got married, and she was a bit older than him. And he lived with her for a while, and then he attended Colby College in Wardorville, Maine. And he graduated in 1899. He was an English major. He was also the yearbook editor. And the yearbook has all sorts of interesting cartoons and caricatures that he drew. So this artistic avocation started pretty early. Stevens, after Colby, went to graduate school at Yale University. He wrote his dissertation on the cross in Anglo-Saxon literature, and it was published in the Yale University Studies in English series, which is quite an honor. Basically, they give that to the best dissertation of the year. And then in the spring of 1904, he took a competitive examination for a position at the Naval Academy. And he placed first and soon headed off to Annapolis. Now, Annapolis at this time was staffing up. Because of the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt as president, the Navy began expanding its fleet dramatically. That meant that the Navy needed many more officers to man these ships. And the officers who were teaching at Annapolis were needed in the fleet. So there was suddenly a shortage of faculty, and the Naval Academy began hiring civilians in a big way. They had hired civilians from the beginning, but suddenly the civilian percentage of the staff expanded pretty dramatically. Most of them tended to come from Ivy League schools, and Stevens actually seemed to be recruiting people that he knew at Yale. Stevens here is seated second from the right. Behind him was his good friend Carol Storrs Alden, who was hired the next year and would outlast Stevens on the faculty. Stevens settled into life at the Naval Academy very quickly. His beginning salary was $2,000 a year. Those were the days, right? And he was in what was called the English department, but which had under its purview both English and history, and at one point ethics as well. So he not only had to teach English literature courses as well as basic naval writing, but he also was teaching about naval history. This isn't something that he knew much about beforehand, but he soon became one of the real experts in the field. It wasn't all work and no play for Stevens. He, in fact, very soon met a young woman who took his fancy, and this was Claudia Wilson Miles. This is not Claudia Wilson Miles. This is her guardian. Claudia Miles was the daughter of a naval officer, Charles Richards Miles, who had died of yellow fever in Haiti in 1889. And then his wife died soon after. And Claudia Stevens and her brother were basically taken under the wing of her uncle, Hugo Osterhaus. Hugo Osterhaus at this point, I believe, was a commander, but his star was rising rapidly. And by the end of his career, he was commander of the Atlantic Fleet, which at that point was the highest position in the Navy. This was before there was a chief of naval operations. So he married very well. He married Claudia Stevens on June 1st, 1904. Now, Claudia's brother, Alfred, was also at the Naval Academy in the class of 1907. He's best known as the man who wrote the words to Anchors Aweigh. In fact, you can see this is his yearbook entry, composer of the famous lyric, Sail Navy Down the Field. He was a musician all his life. You can see that from the little cartoon. When you look at his conduct record, he was constantly getting demerits for improper stowage of musical instrument or playing guitar during study hour or something like that. But he went on to have a full naval career as well, which also had interesting consequences. When the Stevenses were married in June 1904, they needed a place to live. And at this point, the Harwood sisters, Miss Lucy and Miss Hester, decided to advertise for tenants. This is a Stevens picture of the Hammond-Harwood House in 1904. I love the staircase. This is pre-boxwood, as you can see. Foundation plantings weren't very popular in the 19th century. Well, at any rate, they moved in there soon in the summer of 1904. The Harwood's father, William Harwood, had also been a professor of English at the US Naval Academy. And Stevens tells a very interesting story about him. In 1861, when states began to secede from the Union, William Harwood was very pro-Southern, and he ended up going to the Naval Academy gate, the main gate, which at that time was Gate 3 on Maryland Avenue. And he took out an American flag, threw it on the ground, and stamped all over it until he was ejected by the guard. Well, this was the end of his career at the Naval Academy. And during the war, he taught at a school near Baltimore. And he wouldn't take a loyalty oath to the Union, so he had to hike every week to Baltimore. He'd go up, hike on Sunday, come back home on Saturday, and then do it all over again. Stevens suggests that he was rather litigious, and in fact, his obituary does as well. He was trained as a lawyer, and he apparently got into lawsuits with a lot of people in town. The family had very little money, though, by this point, though they owned this spectacular house with a lot of nice furniture in it. Well, Stevens and his wife, Claudia, took pictures of this first house. And here are really the only pictures of Claudia Stevens I have. I don't think she liked getting her picture taken. And they're not the best shots, but these are from the Stevens scrapbook. So they give you a good sense of how that was set up on that black construction paper. And there she is, the mistress of the house, very bright picture in the window. And then with Miss Murdoch, the family cat. Claudia Stevens apparently loved animals. And this is how the apartment looked. This is the room I'm in now. And you can see that some of the furniture looks pretty old, and it was probably from relatives and friends. I will mention, though, two things in these pictures that strike me as significant. The first is, notice how many pictures are on the wall. And it's hard to see exactly what they are, but some of them, I'm sure, are Stevens's own drawings and paintings. Secondly, they did have a little flair about them. Notice the table and the chair on the right. Those are American arts and crafts, stickly stuff, maybe. Very au courant at the period. Here is, could be the very same room. We're debating this, or maybe part of it downstairs. There's the dining room on the right, and there's the bed on the left, discreetly sort of halfway out of the picture. And here we have that piano, and I believe that's the bed behind the curtain. They closed it up. Notice the wicker, once again, a very sort of 1880s, 1890s piece of furniture you'd have in the house. Looks like a pretty nice sideboard, though. I'm not a furniture person, but Sheridan, perhaps, maybe early 19th century, late 18th century. Someone else probably could tell us afterwards. And here is a photo of the wing in winter. This is actually November 1904. There was a big snowstorm that came pretty early. It was snowier in Annapolis back in those days. Stevens tells a number of stories about the Harwood sisters. He says that they were ancient and belonged to another era, that they were dressed in clothes dating from the Civil War. When you think about it, the Civil War was only 40 years earlier. So in fact, I was thinking, I have ties that are older than that. It's nice that they could still fit into them. And they had bonnets that went back to Appomattox. They had very little money. They didn't leave the house very much, and they didn't receive people. They would take the air in their back garden. Miss Lucy, the older, was apparently quite fierce and formidable. And Stevens tells stories about when boys would climb over the fence or to get into the backyard, and she'd come out with a big dueling pistol of ancient vintage and tell them, "You bad boys, I'll shoot if you don't leave." And they did, but I don't think they really thought she was going to shoot. He talks about when the Harwood sisters walked downtown, people would be polite to them, but they would cut people who their father had had lawsuits with. And they would also cut people who had left food at their door. People did that because they worried that they weren't getting enough to eat. Charitable, but they couldn't admit to accepting charity. Stevens tells the story about having a dinner party with the Harwood sisters, and he said that they were very polite, but Miss Hester always followed what Miss Lucy told her to do and imitated her. He said they didn't quite know what to do with the grapefruit that they served, probably not something around during the Civil War in Annapolis. Finally, I've got to mention that when the Stevenses moved in here, they were told they could not change the house. The color had to be colonial buff. Which it sort of still is today as I look around. And they could not have electricity, gas, or telephone. Well, this must have been quite a year, but when you're young, you can put up with a lot. In the spring of the year, actually in June, Miss Lucy died. Stephen said that it was in a Lenten season, and that she fasted too much. Well, I was thinking June, come on, but Easter was late that year, April 23rd. So maybe it was due to privations during Lent. And Miss Hester went away for a while. The Stevenses left and moved to Prince George Street for the following year. One of the things that struck me, I kept looking at this and saying, "Oh, Stevens is exaggerating all these things." And one of the things I found out was that when he moved in 1904, Miss Lucy was only 60 years old and Miss Hester was 53. They were not that ancient. And I thought, oh, he's really exaggerated this. And then I thought, well, when you're 26, everybody over 40 looks pretty decrepit. I remember that. And now, it's the older you get, the less that's the case. And indeed, he remarks at one point in Annapolis and Arundels town that Miss Lucy had dominated Miss Hester for 70 years, which suggests that he didn't really know how old they was. They just looked really old. So that's what he's told us about the Harwood sisters. Now, while he was living on Prince George Street, Stevens had seen enough of Annapolis that he decided that he might share his reflections with us. Oops. There we go. And at Christmas 1906, he published a book called An Annapolis Alphabet, which basically consisted of little caricatures of Annapolis done in an alphabetical format. And they're really pretty funny. Not all of them today, but many of them will ring a bell. Stevens, of course, was a New Englander. Even though he'd seen Burma, Annapolis was a revelation for him. I think he never quite got over what Annapolis was like. It was not like any other American city he had seen. And this book sold very well. This is the one on the left. Another Annapolis Alphabet came out in 1907. But Stevens got into a little bit of trouble with the Annapolis Alphabet. And it was this entry that caused great consternation among the business community. E is for enterprise. Why? Some say of that stuff we are shy. But if you have hope and a strong microscope, a trace of it you may descry. And this, of course, is with Main Street on a busy day with a pair of cows ambling up the middle of the street. Not a person in sight except the guy taking a nap in the gutter. This is next to Benish's department store, which is down at the bottom of Main Street. And you can see Francis going off to the right. The Annapolis Businessmen's Association at this point was really trying to, in the verb used at the time, boom the town and attract businesses and customers to their businesses. And they decried this. They wrote letters to the paper. It actually caused enough of a stir that this first edition was sold out, and I think they even went into a second edition. Other things in the Annapolis Alphabet still ring a bell today. He has a nice bit on X is for excursionist rude. He has one is on L is for legislators. And he says that even though their pay is $5 a day, they often are seen to make more. And he has a picture of a legislator from the Eastern Shore taking a bribe behind his back from someone. And then there is this one. Why is the yard green and spacious, where trembles the cit most audacious? Arrested you are if you smoke a cigar. If you walk in with Fido, good gracious. And here we have the guard, Marine guard at the gate, putting his bayonet into the posterior of someone smoking a cigar. Now, what's interesting about this is 6 months later, Mark Twain visited Annapolis in May of 1907, and he told this story about how he strolled over to the Naval Academy and smoking a cigar, and the Marine ran him off. And part of me wonders whether that really happened or whether Mark Twain had done his research and had seen Stevens's book. Someone would have given it to him, you know, from one, here's our humorist, you know, just like you. And I think he got the idea for this. I know that when Bob Hope was here in 1982, he asked for background material like that. And I wouldn't have been surprised if Twain did the good thing, or else Stevens was just unusually prescient. Finally, let me show you this from an Annapolis Alphabet. F is for Frenching, taking French leave, a sport indulged in far more than it ought. Over wall or straight through the gate you skidoo, then find yourself on the report. Now, you can see the midshipmen going over the wall. They still do it today. I've driven down King George Street at night and seen them drop over. The person in the foreground is a caricature of Stevens himself with a wink and a smile. You know, it strikes me as significant that he shows himself as this liminal figure on the border between the Naval Academy and the city of Annapolis. And he knew, as we know he knew, that this was where William Harwood had had his big moment of departure from the Naval Academy. I think it was a loaded space for him. And maybe once again, he was seeing something in his future. Well, he made a lot of money from this. And he decided to put out a new one. And this is from another Annapolis Alphabet in which he recants Main Street on a busy day. E stands for enterprise. Here is the way that Main Street does appear. The fact that for hustle, big business, and bustle we're famous is perfectly clear. I like the shoppers from Eastport in the foreground. Editor Abbott, the Bentstown Bard discussing a julep. Bentstown Bard, Folger McKenzie, was the Sun columnist on the Capitol. Meeting of the Annapolis Businessmen's Association. They seem to be partying up there at the corner of Francis Street. Eager buyers from Baltimore. It's funny. It's sort of a nice gesture. And then finally this, and this goes back to civilians in the yard. You here may stand for unfit, by which I refer to the sit. While some know their place and prostrate the face, still others don't do it a bit. Now, this very clearly refers to an incident that happened in the spring of 1907, when the son of Mr. Burtis, the market master of Annapolis, went to a Navy baseball game. And he was ejected by the guard, Daniel O'Lone, who said he wasn't supposed to be there. And Mr. Burtis was there and got in a fist fight with O'Lone. And as a result, the superintendent, Admiral Sands, banned all children from attending baseball games by the Navy teams. And he went further to say to close all the gates to civilians, except for the main gate, and you had to state your business before you were allowed into the Naval Academy. Well, at this time, the Naval Academy was the public park. Everybody in Annapolis went over there to watch the sports events and to do things. There was an incredible rebellion in the city. No less than 6 naval officers were beamed with baseballs in various wards of the city over the next week. The Capitol had all these editorials and little witticisms like, by their gates you shall know them, and things like that. And the Naval Academy ultimately backed down, and they opened the gates again to civilians. But it made Stevens increasingly aware of his own position at the Naval Academy. He was on the faculty, but he was a civilian too. And there were ways in which that became clear to him. As I said, these books made a bit of money for Stevens. And indeed, in August of 1907, he and Claudia bought a lot in Wardor. It's almost down at the end of the point. I'm not quite sure. He didn't own the beachfront on the point, but he did have waterfront just next to that last lot. I think it later was the lot that belonged to Vernon Tate, but I'm not absolutely sure. But at any rate, he built a house there. And here he is at work in his studio at Rosemar, which is what they named the house, wearing a Malkittel, an artist's smock that he purchased on a European tour. They also went to Europe in the summer of 1907. So clearly the Annapolis Alphabets did well. Also, a big event of 1907, at the end of the year, the Stevenses had their first son, Hugo Osterhaus Stevens, born on December 28th, 1907, in Carville Hall. They were worried that the doctor wouldn't be able to get out to Wardor, so they checked into Carville Hall to await confinement. One of the things, by the way, about Wardor that Stevens liked was that he canoed to work most of the year. He had a dock and he'd just get in the canoe. He also ice skated to work in the winter. And Hugo Stevens told me that there were only 2 people in Annapolis at that time who ice skated, his father and an old African-American man who was an expert. He said they used to ice skate together at times. He said he was never sure where the African-American man had learned. He must have lived in the North at one point. Well, Stevens had made enough money from the Annapolis Alphabets. They chose to go back to this genre again with the Annapolis Alphabet, or Annapolis Almanac in 1913. And this is a much more sophisticated work, and it's much more aimed at the Naval Academy than it is at Annapolis. And I found this cover interesting because here we have someone in the period about 1860 or so with that dress, and there we have a doorway in the back that looks rather like the Hammond-Harwood House doorway, if you ask me. I could be wrong. It's not exact. But this book caused problems as well. And in fact, this is the entry that did. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson took office as president, and he appointed Josephus Daniels as the Secretary of the Navy. The new Democratic administration launched a lot of naval reforms, and it was Josephus Daniels who got rid of the wine mess in the Navy, no more liquor aboard ships. He instituted education for enlisted personnel, a great thing, but he also said that the Navy had to be ambassadors for the United States. He was playing down the war-making role and seeing them as peacekeepers instead. Well, Stevens did a number of drawings in the Almanac called Naval Reforms, and here is when the Navy becomes democratic, and I think democratic has a double meaning. And here you see an officer with the enlisted, they're dancing together and chowing down together and having a grand old time. Well, the Capitol ran this illustration with the title, A Typical Navy Hop. And William Woodward Phelps, the head of the seamanship department, went ballistic and wrote to the superintendent, the subject of the illustration is incompatible with the position held by the alleged author, tends unnecessarily to ridicule commissioned officers, and is without point, and I respectfully recommend an investigation. The superintendent's aide wrote back, superintendent was Gibbons at this point, and he said, I've discussed this with Professor Stevens, and he apologizes for this context, which wasn't intended by him. And he says it won't happen again. And so that was that. He got his hand slapped, but nothing important. Stevens at the same time was writing about the Naval Academy in other ways. He entered the list of the Naval Academy fiction craze, and these were very popular before World War I, and he wrote Pee Wee Clinton Plebe, The Story of Annapolis. And this was followed by another novel, Messmates, which isn't as good. Pee Wee Clinton's not a bad read. He also started writing naval textbooks. Naval history up to this time was largely biography, or maybe even hagiography. It was all about famous heroes like Nelson and John Paul Jones. Stevens was the first person to begin to really look at tactics and to teach them to midshipmen and strategy. And he knew his Mahan very well, and he took Mahan's lessons of sea power and applied them to books. In fact, this would eventually lead to The History of Sea Power, a textbook that came out in 1920 by Stevens, was used at the Naval Academy into the 1960s in updated versions. This is one of his great boons to the school. The first 10 years of Stevens's time at the Naval Academy were generally pretty happy, but things began to go downhill after the Annapolis Alphabet, or the Annapolis Almanac, for a number of reasons. In 1913, Stevens had applied for a position in the Corps of Professors of Mathematics, which was this strange officer group that included 12 professors at the Naval Academy and at the Naval Observatory, 12 like the disciples, and they wore uniforms. It was like the chaplain's corps, only they taught, and they were given pensions, and they had tenure. At this point, there was no tenure at the Naval Academy. Everybody was on a one-year contract. Well, Congress decided to abolish the Corps in 1916. If any of you knew Theodore Woolsey Johnson, father of Ted Woolsey Johnson, he was the last person commissioned in the Corps, and his father had been a member too. Stevens was the senior professor of English, had been for 10 years, had written a lot, and he asked for this position, but he didn't get it in the Corps. Then it was abolished. There was something called the Alderman Commission that studied the Naval Academy faculty, and it made sweeping changes. It set up the current system of academic titles, assistant, associate, and full professor. People were given 5-year contracts. There was no tenure still. That didn't come till 1937. And it also raised the salaries. Well, Stevens expected to be made head of the English department. In fact, he was not. The position went to C, that should be a period, Alphonso Smith, who was the Poe Professor of English at the University of Virginia. He was a friend of Professor Alderman, who chaired that commission, and also of Josephus Daniels. Smith was a good scholar. He wrote a very important book on O. Henry, and also a very popular book about what literature should mean to you, that many people would read and write him fan letters about. There's a whole file of them up in the Naval Academy archives. Stevens's feelings were hurt when Smith came, but he came to like Smith very much, and Smith was a good man. He was called Beefy by the midshipmen. You can see why. And there's a great story about him that I don't have time to tell you now, but if someone wants to ask me in the question period, I will share it with you. The Stevenses were under strain because of these professional issues. Stevens was also increasingly, it seems, unhappy in Annapolis. He won a prize for an essay he submitted to the Independent, a national magazine, in 1916 called A Suffrage Oasis. And it's supposed to be about the best thing in your hometown. And basically he says Annapolis is horrible. It's run by a corrupt democratic machine. It's dirty. People are living in the 19th century. And he says the one good thing about Annapolis are the women of the suffrage movement. And not Claudia Stevens is one of the leaders of that. And he talks about the Just Government League, a group of women who tried to improve sanitary conditions in Annapolis in the years before the war. This didn't make him more popular. They in fact sold their house in 1917, and there was some thought that they might leave Annapolis at that point. Stevens had been offered other positions elsewhere, but eventually they stayed in town, and ultimately, after living on Martin Street, built a house at number 3 Cumberland Court. Hugo, their older son, went off to boarding school in New York at this time, and the Stevenses have a complete album of postcards that Stevens sent to his son Hugo. They're wonderful. They're all illustrated like this. As I said, there are about 100 of them, and we have Hugo's responses. Hugo became an artist, as I've mentioned, and he would try to imitate his father with his own caricatures. So I'll just point out, here we have on the left, Stevens practicing to make the graduation address at the Annapolis High School. At the top right, he shows Hugo blinking. He said, "You've got to quit this. And here is how it looks. Get some friend to watch you for it. I read in yesterday's paper of a new eye disease in Poland where children begin by blinking and go blind from exhaustion of the muscle. That made me think of you." I think every parent can sympathize, as can every child. Hugo was not blinking when I met him 60 years later. And then finally, "Dear Hugo, here's a poor college prof wondering how he can make both ends meet on his salary." And the Stevenses did have money problems. Hugo got the flu in 1918. The family credits Dr. Sewell Hepburn for saving his life, but he ended up in Johns Hopkins Hospital, and apparently the medical bills came to over a year's salary ultimately. Makes you appreciative of health insurance and Obamacare, at least me. Well, here's the final chapter of Stevens's life at the Naval Academy. Everything came to a head in 1921 with the appointment of Rear Admiral Henry Braid Wilson as superintendent of the Naval Academy. Wilson really did not like civilian faculty. He felt that he said that they don't really know anything about the Navy, and it's better to have officers teach, men who have been through this thing. He was commander of the Atlantic Fleet during World War I. He also noticed the angle of his cover or his cap. He always wore it that way, very non-professional. He also carried a cane a lot of the time. Once again, not something you should do as an officer. But as is so often the case, he was also a micromanager. He would inspect the yard for parking violations personally. He would wait at the main gate to see midshipmen coming in late and personally give them demerits. There's a wonderful order that he issued in which he stipulated that midshipmen using the Naval Academy pool were not allowed to ingest water into their mouths and spit it out again because it was unsanitary. Okay, they just had the flu, but still, you try to swim and do that. Stevens ran up against Wilson. The other thing about Wilson is he was a battleship man. Stevens was an early advocate of air and submarine power, and he was allied with admirals William Sowden Sims, Bradley Fiske, who were taking the opposite tack. These were friends of Uncle Hugo. So Stevens was setting himself up for trouble. And other things came up as well with Wilson. One was that Claudia Stevens, to make more money, decided to open a tea room. And there it is on State Circle. You recognize the building. this was seen as something unbecoming a professor's wife. She had gone into business. You didn't do that. And indeed, if any of you knew Elizabeth Drake, who was the daughter of Admiral Harry Hill, she told me once, she said, when I was growing up in Annapolis in the teens and 20s, I could only socialize with the children of professors, of lawyers, and doctors. She said, I don't know how many times I heard officers speak of someone and say, such a nice man, what a shame he's in trade. And she said it was so silly. But this was what Mrs. Stevens was running up against. She sort of broke the class codes. Well, the final straw, and there were two, was, first of all, in 1923, Stevens published an article in the Yale Review called Scrapping Mahan, in which he argues against the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. This set a quota for American, British, and Japanese ships, and said that America had to basically retrench in the Pacific. Stevens said that we would be at war with Japan within 20 years, and he strongly advocated fortifying Pearl Harbor against air and sea attack. Well, was he prescient? In a way, though he wasn't the only person to say this at the time, but this went against official naval policy. And then the final thing with Admiral Wilson, when he, 15 years earlier, when he was in command of a gunnery crew on a ship, Stevens's brother-in-law, Alfred Miles, had served under him. Miles had made a mistake, and Admiral Wilson cursed him out. Wilson was known for having a very foul mouth, and Alfred decked him, knocked him out on the ship. Now, this was a court-martialable offense, and it could have led to great trouble, but Uncle Hugo was still in the picture, and I've seen the performance evaluations, and he's marked down at the bottom with no reason, and then he comes up the next time around. So it was hushed up, but Admiral Wilson didn't forget. In 1922, Admiral Wilson went on the warpath, and the Navy appropriations were cut substantially, and he fired a third of the civilian faculty. There was a fight in Congress about this, but many left. And then again, in 1924, he came again, and Stevens was one of the people axed. It happened a week after graduation. C. Alphonso Smith had died during graduation week. He sent this final message to the brigade, and Stevens had no recourse. And he wrote this rather sad statement saying, I have turned down the chairmanship of the English department at Antioch College and at Colby College and the Poe professorship at Virginia. Actually, when Smith came here, they offered Stevens the job because I thought I would spend my life at the Naval Academy. And they gave him 6 months' pay, but that was it. Stevens went on to become the headmaster of the Roger Ascham School in White Plains, New York, and then the first headmaster of the Cranbrook School in Bloomfield Hills, Detroit, where he had a very interesting career for 8 years, but he left in 1935, and for the rest of his life, he wrote for his living. He wrote 20 books in 20 years, and the first book he wrote was Annapolis and Arundels Town, and he came back here to revisit these scenes from his past. And it's a wonderful book. If you haven't read it, you should, because it gives the flavor of the town, especially at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. This is one of his own paintings. He did all the drawings. And one of my favorite drawings is this one of the Hammond-Harwood House doorway. And in fact, all of these pen and ink sketches were sold on boards after the fact for $3 and $5 at the Dayton Hudson department store in Detroit. Afterwards, I wish I had known. I would have tried to pick up a few if I had been living back then. But at any rate, Stevens spent the rest of his life writing. He asked the Naval Academy if he could come back to help teach during World War II. He was turned down because the year after he had left, he had written some articles very unflattering to Admiral Wilson that appeared in the New York World. and the New Orleans Times-Picayune. Navy had a long memory. And in 1949, a private bill was introduced into Congress to give him a pension. He had no pension. The Naval Academy opposed it, in part because he wrote bad things about the Naval Academy. However, Congress passed it. And starting in 1951, he did get a pension of $100 a month for the rest of his life. And he died in 1955 of Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 77. Well, this about wraps it up. I think that what I would say is, if you look at Annapolis and Arundels town, the final pages consist of Stephen sitting on the steps of the Chase Lloyd House, looking across the street at the Hammond-Harwood House doorway. And he imagines all the people from Annapolis's past that come strolling up and down Maryland Avenue, some of them going into the house. He remembers those Harwood sisters, I think, rather fondly. And it's I think, wonderfully sort of romantic. He sets it on a June night with a breeze from the bay. He doesn't mention the lindens blooming, but they would have been at that point. And across the street at the Chase Lloyd House. And this is how he ends. And I think the Hammond-Harwood House came to embody what Annapolis was all about for Stevens. It really was the city. And I've overspoke, I think, my time. So Rachel's on board. Do you want to take any questions, Rachel?
Yeah, Mike, I just want to say what an excellent lecture it was. I think we all learned a lot, and what an interesting person William Oliver Stevens was. So I don't think we have any questions in the chat. If you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourselves, and we'd love to have Mike answer those. If you're willing to take some questions, Mike?
I'm delighted to, and if no one has questions, I'll tell one or two of the good stories I didn't tell.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, Linda Paez here. I heard you mention that only he and one other man were ice skating to the Naval Academy from their home, and you mentioned that the other man was African American. Is there any information or name for that person?
I know this story. Excuse me, I know this story from Hugo Stevens, and I don't think he knew. So no, this is the only place I've heard it. But who knows? If you read the Capitol closely, you could probably find out, or ask among the African American community. Though this is now over 100 years ago, so it's hard to tell.
I could research the Capitol. Could you give me some dates?
Well, he started ice skating in would have been 1907.
Okay.
And Hugo would have remembered it probably sometime over the next 10 years. That's a lot of reading, but I'll tell you, the Capitol is really entertaining reading if you live in Annapolis. I read 40 years of it, and it was something I look forward to. I do about a half an hour a day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you for your question, Linda. Does anybody else have a question for?
I have a question.
David, yeah.
Sure. What did, if you know, which part of the house did he live in?
Kitchen wing.
Pardon me?
The kitchen wing.
The kitchen wing, okay.
Upstairs and maybe partly downstairs. We were over here trying to figure it out. But it's very clear. He said the kitchen wing, and the Capitol said the west wing, which is the kitchen wing.
Okay, all right.
So I'm upstairs right above the kitchen right now.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mike, oh, go ahead.
No, I have a question. It's sort of indelicate. Was there plumbing in the house? What did they do for bathrooms? Or maybe you don't know.
I think that's a question for Rachel. I don't know.
To our knowledge, Fran, in 1875, right behind us here, there was a little addition put on, and there may have been some type of plumbing in there. The Harwoods had a rather unfortunate incident in the winter of 1867 where their outhouse was burned, and most likely after that, they probably invested in some type of plumbing. We know in this wing in 1875, they added on that small addition. And there was some type of plumbing put in around that time, I believe. And for the main block of the house, there's no plumbing in there now, but there was another renter who lived there, and he did put plumbing in around 1906. It's now our game room, but there was plumbing at one time in the main block of the house.
And I can add one thing to that. The city got its water system in the late 1860s. That's when they first began to pipe water into the city. So, and do away with the wells. So 1875, they could have been hooked up to the city water system.
Yeah, certainly after your outhouse burns, it kind of prompts you into the into the future, I guess. Mike, do you know anything about, you said Miss Hesse went away for a while. Was she in DC, or do you know?
I don't know. Stevens just said she went away and came back looking a lot younger and began to wear jewelry and seemed to come out from under her sister's shadow. I'll tell you, if no one else has a question, I'll tell you two stories. One is about Alfred Hart Miles and how he got his appointment to the Naval Academy. And this is something about research. Hugo Stevens said that he had actually done 4 years at William and Mary and graduated, but he got out, had no job, was sleeping on park benches and stuff. And he decided, I'll go to the Naval Academy. And he still just fit within the age limitation. And he had very little time before his birthday, and he went to Washington, spent his last of his money to do this, and then went to the White House. Now, it was easier to get into the White House then, but according to Hugo, there was also an American Indian delegation going to visit the president at this time. And he's Alfred, whose grandmother was Spanish and he had an olive complexion, fit in with the Indian group and went into the office. And according to Hugo, all the Native Americans left, and Hugo then sort of came forward and said, I want an appointment to the Naval Academy, Mr. President, and I want it now. And Roosevelt looked at him very deliberately, reached into his desk and pulled out a pistol and leveled it on him and made him explain. And eventually he explained well enough that Roosevelt had his assistants call the Navy Department. They found out about his father's service record, and he got the appointment. Well, I heard this and I said, well, this is too good to be true. It sounds like a made up story. I went to the Library of Congress and looked at Roosevelt's papers, and I had an approximate date for this. I knew the date of the appointment. The week before, a delegation from the Carlisle Indian School, who would have been Alfred's age, visited the White House. And the same week, Roosevelt had received a gift of a pistol from Richard Harding Davis. And he wrote back a thank you note saying, it's a real Krakow pistol, I keep it right here. So I was amazed. I said, I could verify this family story with actual documents. So that was fun.
Yeah. Mike, I did want to say something. Cathy Clark here.
Oh, hi, Cathy.
Yeah. I remember when I first came to Annapolis and saw it in the 70s, there isn't any park here. It is the Naval Academy. And I loved how you talked about all the connection between the town and the academy, because they're so close. We need them, and perhaps they need us too. I thought your lecture was great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, it was great. I wish everyone could hear it. A wonderful connection between the Naval Academy and the town of Annapolis. I think you really described it so well.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Mike before? No?
I have one more. What percentage of the faculty at the Naval Academy are civilian?
Well, they like to say it's 50-50, but it hasn't always been 50-50. In the late 19th century, it went down to about 23 or 24% civilian. And then during World War I, it went up to well over 50%. And Wilson, in a way, was evening things out. Hugo also said, I got him on tape saying this, he said, My father said afterwards that he didn't really blame Wilson. He said he had been insubordinate, and given who Wilson was, he had to fire him. And Stephen said, you know, I was in a rut. After 20 years, he wasn't going anywhere else at the Naval Academy. That was clear. And I think it was good for him to get out of there. And he felt that too, which I think testifies to his mental hygiene in the sense that he made the best of it and was happy.
Thank you.
Great.
Wow.
Would you like my one last funny story?
Yeah, great.
Okay, this is about C. Alfonso Smith, who it's called Beefy. And apparently there's a story told that Smith was finding midshipmen didn't like to read the stuff that they were supposed to read for class. I mean, who can believe such a thing? But at any rate, he decided to tell all the firsties, he said, there are books that you should never read that are absolutely improper for officers and gentlemen. And he gave them a list beginning with Boccaccio's The Decameron, saying, never, never open this book. Well, apparently there was a big rush on sales of the Decameron in Annapolis. And apparently, if you look back at mids who had graduated in those early years of the 1920s, all of them knew the Decameron inside out, as well as a few other things. So happy tip for teachers. Going, go on.
Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, Mike. And, you know, I think that also this brings light to, you know, the many different facets of history involved in Hammond-Harwood House. We at Hammond-Harwood House has had a long relationship with the Naval Academy in many different areas, you know, from William Harwood working there, William Oliver Stevens, and there were also other renters who, you know, rented from the Harwood Sisters that we could maybe do future lectures on connected to the Naval Academy. In fact, I think one of our docents who's listening now, Dottie Barley, her grandfather, Lieutenant Guy Davis, actually rented out the other wing of the house, and her mother was born here. So there's lots of wonderful connections that continue to this day.
You can do a whole renter series.
Yeah, we could do a whole renter series, exactly. So thank you, Dr. Mike Parker, and thank you all for listening to today's lecture. It will be recorded and sent out via email for future use. And please, you know, share it with friends and family, because this is a very interesting story to hear.
And thank you. It's been a pleasure. Goodbye.
Many thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Great.